Hello, my name is Tirsa Coates, and I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Decision Lens. I have the privilege of emceeing today's event, the Decision Lens Risk Summit. We have some very rich discussion planned for you today on how to incorporate risk into your portfolio strategy. And we have a lot to cover, so we're going to jump right in and get started. First, we have all the phones muted for the benefit of our speakers, but we really want this session to be as interactive as possible. We want to hear from you. So at any time during the call, please use the WebEx chat feature. Look for Maddie, and then send her your questions, send her the challenges you're facing in risk management, send her the best practices that you would recommend. We'll address as many of these as possible throughout the hour, but we'll also dedicate time at the end of the call to make sure we can share your thoughts with all the attendees. For context, let me tell you a little bit about who Decision Lens is. In a nutshell, Decision Lens is the premier solution for strategic portfolio prioritization and resource allocation. Our solutions are the underpinnings of many of the organizations you see here on this slide. Our clients use Decision Lens to prioritize investments in projects, in programs, and technologies, to make sure they align to their organization's strategic goals. And Decision Lens' powerful analytics and visualizations really provide the insight that our clients need so that they can optimally fund, schedule, and then execute those investments so they deliver the greatest returns. And a key component for maximizing those returns is being able to evaluate and then mitigate the risks that are inherent in those investments. And so that's why we're all together on the call today. We have a very full agenda. We'll lead in with some background on the importance of understanding risk and the implications to your various portfolios. We'll hear from Minnesota Department of Transportation, on their success assessing risk areas for their 2015 Risk Assessments Program. We'll share a few proven approaches to modeling risk in Decision Lens, and we'll dedicate some time to hear from you also during this Risk Summit. So a lot of great content. We have three fantastic speakers lined up for you today. First, Karsten DuPont, a senior client manager here at Decision Lens and a subject matter expert in risk assessment. We have Tracy Hatch, CFO, COO, and Deputy Commissioner of Minnesota DOT. And then Suzanne Thayer, Program Manager for the Safeguarding Group at Minnesota DOT. So again, we'd like you to send your questions, challenges, and recommendations via WebEx chat to Maddie, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Karsten, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to talk about the importance of understanding risk.
Great. Thanks, Tirsa. This summit is intended as a discussion of ideas and concepts related to informing a decision process with risk considerations. In our work with customers across various industries, we frequently come upon decision factors that, in one way or another, relate to risk. Based on these experiences and the challenge that we have helped customers work through in capturing risk, we felt this would be a worthwhile discussion. A common challenge we see with our customers relates to the question, how do I convey some aspect of risk in this decision model, as I know it is an important consideration for our process and for my leadership. Later in the presentation, we will review several model samples, each taking a slightly different approach to modeling a decision with risk considerations. This is not intended to be an exhaustive review, as there are dozens of different ways to capture risk in decision models, each unique to the decision, process, and desired insights. We simply want to provide a review of a handful of different approaches to help you develop your own thinking about how you might address some of your risk concerns. In this lead-in, we will address some relatively basic risk concepts and issues to establish a framework. It is particularly important to establish this context because risk is talked about in so many different ways across the spectrum of decision-making scenarios. We have found that at the beginning of a decision process, when we ask our customer counterparts what they mean by risk, it can be difficult for them to convey clearly. Please note this is not a criticism, just an acknowledgement that, for all of us, risk is a very difficult thing to get our arms around and communicate effectively within our organizations. One of our goals is to help customers create a more structured decision-making environment so we see the applicability of Decision Lens to help organizations capture risk appropriately and make more informed decisions with risk as a distinct decision factor. Decision Lens helps you to answer the question, why? Today we're going to talk about ways to help you answer that question in the context of risk and why it matters to your organization and its objectives. Put another way, the discussion is focused on informing your decisions with a risk lens. What is risk? This slide conveys the first challenge that organizations have to address when factoring risk into a decision process. In practical terms, it is very important to understand how we capture risk considerations in our decision making. Risk itself is not a complex concept, but it is a word that gets used in many different ways. What's the risk? What risk am I willing to accept? Is that project at risk? What do we mean? Identifying this first is critical. This is likely to resonate with those on the call who have been asked by different people in your organization about risk. Without some follow-on discussion and analysis, how this question is answered could take you in multiple directions. Context and purpose really matters when talking about risk and how it influences your decisions. Examples of some of the questions that can arise are we talking about threats, adverse events that can be caused by individuals or groups? Or are we concerned about naturally occurring events? Is it a persistent concern, so it happens with some regular frequency and the issue becomes how you mitigate it? Or is there more uncertainty involved? Finally, how can you measure the impact in a way that is most meaningful to you? The list of questions goes on. Again, ensuring the risk questions are clarified up front is a vital step to factoring it into your decision modeling process effectively. Fundamentally, risk comes down to two components: probability or likelihood, and impact or consequence. It all comes down to some level of uncertainty and adverse effect to your organization. Some different categories of risk are also listed here. These are some that you might be concerned about. The reasons for and the ways in which you may care about these different areas of risk varies, so it is extremely useful to break risk up, where possible, into its different categories and components. This is one of the key themes of today's webinar. Breaking out risk in different ways helps you get a better answer to the question, why, and gives your organization more meaningful insight. Back to probability and impact. How these two components of risk are combined will also vary. Impact may change over time. It may not. What people are often referring to when they ask, what's the risk, is the likelihood. But it is an incomplete consideration without the impact. Periodic assessments of risk highlight the fact that probability and impact of certain events will evolve over time as certain mitigating actions take effect. And perhaps your level of tolerance for risk may also vary based on other factors. These considerations are always unique to the type of decision and process. So, for example, as a project manager, some of my planning considerations may change. As a result, the level of risk that I see in one area is no longer in the acceptable range. We would then need to apply new or augmented mitigation measures to try to reduce the level of risk to a level within my risk appetite. Ultimately, it is important to truly understand what questions we are asking about the components of risk, probability and impact, and the categories of risk before we can have a clear picture of how we can assess it and meaningfully inform a decision process. Without breaking risk up into these components and categories first, it is increasingly likely that we would not effectively apply the risk lens, thereby missing the mark in our planning and implementation. In this era of constant innovation, there is a lot of positive language tied to risk-taking. This can be misleading. Risk is real and needs to be first understood and then managed. When you are looking at a plan or at selecting from investment options, you want to look at a comprehensive picture. You're interested in the value or importance of your options, but to have a really complete perspective, you need to understand other aspects such as feasibility. With full risk awareness, you can ensure that you are managing your process appropriately, monitoring the right areas and making adjustments where necessary, driven by your risk considerations. By informing your decisions with this risk lens, you can plan across the near, mid, and long term, apply your resources appropriately and efficiently, inform your strategy and priorities, and take proactive action to address the risks of most concern at the right time. Too often risk is minimized or ignored, or at best misunderstood. We heard from an expert at Darden Business School at the University of Virginia in a recent Decision Lens webinar about the application of certain biases to planning and decision making. Dr. Grushka Cocaine talked about a few concepts, one of which was the planning fallacy. The application of this concept to planning processes means that it is likely that projects will cost more, take longer, and deliver less than expected. One of the main reasons that this occurs is a lack of appreciation for and understanding of risk. Risk is embedded in what we do on a regular basis. Acknowledging it, understanding it in the context of your objectives and decision, and managing it are all very important. One of the most interesting components of decision model building with our customers is how to address risk as a decision factor. It comes up in many different decisions, across industries, verticals, and decision types. In each specific case, it is handled a bit differently, as it should. Risk that is considered generally or over-aggregated, so to speak, is not the most meaningful input into a decision process. Later on, I'll review a handful of examples of how risk can be captured to support your decision-making. For example, we can capture risk by developing a dedicated risk assessment model, embedding individual criteria to address risk, and describing the rating scales, the measure of scoring against a criterion in terms of risk. Once this modeling approach is determined, you can then figure out the best way to measure risk within that framework. In some cases, it is captured in an aggregated risk score, and in others, it is disaggregated into its fundamental components of probability and impact. It really depends on what you want to do with the information in the context of your decision model and your process. In general, addressing the distinct components and categories of risk gives you the ability to understand the why. What drives an elevated level of risk? In what specific risk category? Is it primarily the impact or the probability that drives the level of risk? What kind of impact are we concerned about? These are all questions that can be answered by modeling with risk. One of the great benefits of Decision Lens is that you can capture the value of different projects or capital investments based on a set of criteria that are both blends of qualitative and quantitative and include non-commensurate scales. We are also able to measure and track risk over time. This is a particularly helpful practice. It allows you to focus attention on certain risks at different stages of the process, thereby enabling the most efficient use of your limited time and resources. Finally, we can look at risk at different levels. Risk can be considered at the strategic level to support senior board and executive level briefings. In this context, how certain adverse events can impact your organization's high-level objectives. It can also be assessed at a more tactical level by program and project managers when planning and managing the implementation of a major new program or system. We'll look at some examples of these approaches when we look at decision model samples that incorporate risk. In any case, we can build these modeling and measuring approaches in a way that supports each of the key risk steps identified in the right side graphic. I hope that sets a good framework for the rest of the webinar. Back to you, Tirsa.
Thanks, Carson. Thanks for that framework. While you were speaking, somebody submitted a challenge. Well, I would categorize it as a challenge that they're facing, probably something that's familiar to a lot of people on the call. You talked about periodic assessment of risk. What's the best way to execute that in a risk management program? Do you have any advice?
Sure. No, that's actually a very relevant question because one of the models that we're actually going to show when we go through the third portion of the webinar is we'll actually look at a model where it captures a temporal component. It captures a assessment of the risk over time. So it really does get to that risk management piece. Once you start to periodically assess, you're moving just beyond the kind of a little bit more one-dimensional risk assessment, and we're starting to get into risk management and measuring risk over time, which we can do in a modeling approach that I'll show, does allow you to sort of adjust your mitigation plan, adjust your actions to address those risks over time. So hopefully we'll show that in one of the models that we illustrate.
Okay, good. All right, great. We'll come back to it then. All right, so we're going to keep moving forward. I'm super excited to introduce our next speakers, Tracy Hatch and Suzanne Thayer from Minnesota DOT. I'm going to quickly share their bios with you so you have a sense of the expertise that they're bringing to this risk summit. Tracy Hatch is the Deputy Commissioner as well as the CFO and COO for the Minnesota DOT, and she's been in that role since June 2013. Tracy serves as the agency spokesperson for key budget, control, and financial matters, and she provides leadership to implement financial best practices. She previously served the department as CFO for the preceding 2 years. Tracy has held a variety of finance and administrative positions over her 17 years of state service, including positions at the Departments of Corrections, Education, and Human Services. Suzanne Thayer, she is the Safeguarding Manager for the Minnesota DOT. And there she manages the internal controls in financial reporting. Her role was established in 2012, and Suzanne has led, developed, and staffed a new internal control unit that works alongside the agency's audit function. And under her leadership, she's led her team to successfully integrate governance, risk, and compliance into the agency's strategic objectives. Suzanne has spent 24 years with the MnDOT Office of Audit, and she's led a staff of auditors in conducting difficult and sensitive investigations and continuous audits for the department. So a lot of experience between our two speakers here. Tracy and Suzanne, I'd like to pass the presentation over to you. You have the floor. Let me know when you'd like me to advance the slides, and you guys are welcome to go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Sounds good, Tirza. Thank you so much. Suzanne and I, this is Tracy. Suzanne and I are delighted to be with you today to share our experience with doing risk assessments, particularly on the internal control side of the house. Before I begin, our state law, and many folks on the call will appreciate this, our state law requires that I just provide the disclaimer that while we did use the Decision Lens tool to support this work, that we cannot advocate for any particular private entity, and so we are sharing our experience, but in no way should that be taken as an endorsement for a product. Having said that, we started actually our risk framework in terms of the internal control program a few years ago. There was a state law that was passed that actually formalized the need for every state agency in Minnesota to develop a framework for internal controls. And part of that framework includes, of course, doing financial risk assessments. We established the Safeguarding MnDOT program, of which Susie Thayer is the program manager, a couple of years ago. And the reason that we even called it Safeguarding MnDOT is because we felt that when you talk about risk and when you talk about internal controls in particular, it can give the wrong impression to folks. And so what we really wanted to do is to convey a message that risk and managing risk, including in the financial arena, is really a way to come alongside staff in their normal day-to-day business and provide them with some structures, some tools, and some ways to make sure that we're achieving the outcome that we really set out to do. And, you know, we have a tagline that it is protecting our staff, our assets, and our reputation. So I think that really set the foundation for us in terms of how to proceed with looking at financial risk within the department. We also thought it was very important to establish a governance council, which we did. And that governance council was a key player in how we used Decision Lens to take what essentially was very qualitative criteria. And I think for a lot of folks managing risk, that's always the challenge, how to take something that feels very qualitative and somehow make it quantitative. And so we found that this process seemed to work well for us. We can advance to the next slide, actually. That's okay. So one of the reasons that we undertook, in particular, using this as a tool to help us with these risk assessments was because, of course, any kind of risk program is ultimately about trying to recognize those risks and avoid any surprises. We don't want to be surprised. We don't want our governor to be surprised. And, of course, we want to be able to manage the assets we have. We have about a $3 billion annual budget. We have tens of billions of dollars in assets. We own about 75 to 80% of the state's total assets. And so we see it as a very important role to make sure that we're managing those assets appropriately. Of course, we have a keen eye always in the financial arena to fraud, waste, or abuse, and I might even say the suggestion or the implication of fraud, waste, or abuse. Any organization of any size or any reputation understands that it doesn't actually need to be fraud, waste, or abuse that gets you above the fold on the front page. Even the allegation of fraud, waste, or abuse can have serious damaging repercussions for any organization. And of course, then if it's found to be inaccurate, the reporting on the inaccuracy never quite makes it to the level of the report of the allegation. So we take not only the prevention of fraud, waste, and abuse very seriously, but we take the even the allegation or suggestion. And so again, that is part of how we try to safeguard our staff, our assets, and ultimately our reputation from risk. So we use this process to identify some financial risk assessment, financial processes that we might want to take a closer look at, and then ultimately to take the information, and Susie's going to talk a little bit more about this in detail, but ultimately we use this to take some qualitative criteria, establish a process by which we had folks vote on that qualitative criteria, which then we mirrored up with the individual business processes. And we actually, for an organization of this size, could have had, 500 processes. And Susie will explain to you kind of a little bit about how we narrowed it down to a more manageable number. And then we walked through this process. We had a number of people vote and rank on those processes relative to the criteria that we established. And in the end, really ended up with a quantitative list of processes that were in ranked order, that we had some statistical analysis behind, that we can then use to say these are the top, in this case, 9 processes that we're going to do some sort of action on this next year. And in some of those cases, it is going to be a comprehensive financial risk assessment. And in other cases, we found that we could do some other kind of mitigating control to help eliminate the gaps that were identified. Another thing that we really liked about this process is the documentation of the process, and having all of the votes being recorded in the tool, having a systematic way to walk through, identifying these risks. Our Office of the Legislative Auditor here in Minnesota, and I suspect every state, and even if you're not a state entity, you have auditors that come in and audit you periodically, probably annually. One of the things that the Office of the Legislative Auditor here in Minnesota has been looking for is when you're doing risk assessments, how did you decide that those would be the risk assessments you would do out of all of the potential options? Why those 5 or why those 9? And so we really liked that this provided us a systematic way to walk through those processes. And then, of course, to make sure that things were left on the list, that even if we didn't select them, and we have good rationale for why that's the case. So if we could advance to the next slide, Susie's going to walk us through a little bit more in detail in terms of how we walk through this process.
Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Thayer, and Tracy really did a good job kind of giving us that basis of what we needed to actually go through and accomplish this process. And we started this process this year in January, and what we needed to do was, myself and my staff, was we needed to really conduct a high-level review of all the business processes, because like Tracy said, we had so many. How do we tailor it to a reasonable amount? And so that was a big challenge for myself and my staff, and we worked through that by really this basic task of going through the org chart, going through each office, looking at business practices in the offices, documenting those, and really just building a model of what the agency is built upon. And then we added some things to help make that list a little smaller. Like maybe we would look at areas based on dollar amounts. We would throw out areas that were at a certain threshold, or we would look at how many times an area or a process had been audited and had significant findings. Things like that to help us get down to a manageable list. And what we got down to was a list of actually 34 that we brought to the governance governance council. So if you want to go to the next slide, I kind of will talk about the risk assessment criteria. What we needed to do with the next was with the risk assessment, was build the risk assessment criteria, and we needed management, as Tracy indicated, because our statute was defining us as to have a process in place that indicated how you chose or how you did not choose a risk assessment to be done. And so our governance, we met with the governance group and we talked about things that were important to the group. And the group is made up of people in operations and administration, legal, audit, of various areas. And so each person had a little bit different view of what it meant to them, what an impact of risk would have meant to them. So we got down to having 5 areas here, and we broke it into some child criteria below that. Just like if you look at risks to guidance, management, oversight, we specifically looked at things like legal issues, record storage and data maintenance, audit observations and findings, and agency governance, and how decisions would affect those areas.
In the tool, as Susie mentioned, the top layer you see there where it says risk to guidance, management, oversight, that was considered a parent criteria, and then the 4 you'll see in the bullets there below it was considered the child criteria. So the tool really was helpful to walk through and compare the child criteria against each other, and then also against the parent criteria, and then to weight the parent criteria all against each other. So it was pretty robust. I think it worked really well for us.
Yep, and you can see the percentages, how it came out for us. This is how it came out for us this time around. At this time, and I want to stress that it's how it came out for us at this time in our environment right now. So if we do this again in 6 months, this could change. The look could change because there's environmental factors changing, or things within the business is changing. And I think Carson alluded to that as part of what he talked about is managing that risk, being able to do that. So if you would like to go to the next slide. Our process, basically what I'd gotten to was that we ended up evaluating 34 risk assessment areas from across our agency. And after the pairwise was done, which was where the governance staff ranked the child and the parent areas, we had to determine what subject matter experts would vote to determine their relevance. And that again was another big decision on how do you choose. We have 4,200 employees, and who's the best person to do this, and how many in an area. We did a lot of research, and we talked to people, and we talked to supervisors, line employees, all the way through. And what we ended up with was having 140 employees that served as subject matter experts. It included management, supervisory, line staff. It was a group of different perspectives that brought broad-based input, which is what we wanted for this, because we wanted this to be at a high level. What was really exciting was that we got 95% participation, and you do it in a pretty quick turnaround time. Then we were able to take that information and look at it and review it with the model. Gave us some different ways to view the information, and we could document then where we wanted to go. And what we did was we took, we first looked at the top 10, and then we actually saw that the numbers calculated out to actually have a really good break between number 9 and 10. And so we looked at the top 9, and those were the ones that we felt, after we did like basically a smell test, is this how we thought it should come out? We agreed. Then we were able to go in and put on a decision on what we were going to do with them. And Tracy mentioned we decided to do either a full-blown risk assessment with some of them, or maybe another way to mitigate them a little bit differently. We documented that, and we were able to put that in our plan, and then we actually now were able to report that to the auditors as our documented plan for this next year. The piece that will be interesting for us to be able to see how it works is looking at it maybe in 6 months, doing a review, seeing where we're at, seeing if we need to move any of those that we chose originally around. So I think that's one of the challenges we have yet to come. Let's see here. It was very exciting just to be able to go from having all that qualitative data or qualitative information to a quantitative piece, and that's what I think made it a more successful, was because we had some more visuals. We could wrap our hands around it more.
And we're very excited to receive our next audit, so we can share that with the auditors.
Exactly.
I think they're going to be pretty pleased with what we've done this year.
Yeah, it's not very often you hear about people being excited about the next audit, so that's really an interesting story. I got a question for you guys. You mentioned a tight turnaround. Someone wants to know, how long did the process take?
Well, if you want to talk about all the research, I guess we started in January, and we needed to be done by June 30th. So we had 6 months. But the actual voting part, when we got to the voting part, we did not have a lot of time to give the people to vote. They basically had about a week and a half to do that voting, and so we did a lot of reminders. We had to do some one-on-one help with getting people using the tool. But all in all, we were really impressed that we still had a 95% people vote response.
And when we actually did the parent and child voting at the governance council, so again, it's a group, let's say maybe about 18 people, very high senior leaders in the organization. We did that voting in a matter of a couple of hours at governance. Part of the setup time, the kind of preparations time, was we went from not knowing anything about the tool at all to being able to do that. So when Susie mentions that we had a little bit of research time, that's really what it was. Learning the tool, kind of getting set up, evaluating what criteria we would use. And if I might just put a little plug in for Dr. Allison Denton, who served as our consultant with the Decision Lens team. She was phenomenal and really helped us to be able to frame what we were trying to accomplish. And she was masterful in working with the group and facilitating that meeting as well. So all in all, it was a really, really excellent process.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this story with us today. Just hearing about the scope of the program, how quickly you guys had to build something from scratch, and that it was, so successful with a 95% participation rate is really impressive. So thanks so much for sharing the story. I know that it's going to be valuable to a lot of people who have joined on the call, just to know that this is possible and it can be done, and it's something that, they can get started on pretty quickly and see some success. So thank you so much, Suzanne and Tracy, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and bring Karsten back online. He's going to recommend some additional approaches to modeling risk in your portfolio. So Karsten has several practical tactics that you can use to start building into your portfolio planning today. Karsten, you want to walk us through some?
Sure. Thanks, Tirsa. So as Tirsa mentioned, in the next portion of the webinar, I'm going to review several different approaches listed here on this slide. And actually, you'll see some similarities in the first one that I'm going to review, which is essentially a strategic risk assessment. You'll see some similarities with what Tracy and Suzanne just described in their process, and it might help to illustrate some of the things that they were describing. So that's a great segue. So with that, I'm going to exit PowerPoint. And we're going to go to the first of the models, and I'll make sure you've got the best view here. Okay. This first model assesses a service provider's strategic risks. That is, the risks that the organization faces to their strategic objectives. The purpose is to prioritize the risks so that the risks of highest concern rise to the top. Keep this in mind as we go through the model. We'll start with the decision criteria. You can first see the fundamental components of risk as described earlier, impact and probability. What you also see captured in the criteria are two additional risk factors: velocity, a measure of the speed at which this risk could affect the organization, and the effectiveness of current mitigation efforts, a measure of how well your existing risk controls or mitigation plans are reducing the overall levels of risk. Let's look a little bit more closely at impact. What if you could measure impact with respect to the strategic objectives that your organization has set? Again, we get better insight by breaking up risk components into distinct pieces. Here we see that this model further delineates the impact with respect to this service provider's high-level objectives. 5 distinct areas of impact have been captured. The stakeholders in the organization have scored each risk against each of these subcomponents, or child criteria, of the overall impact, in addition to these other factors. The next building block of the model is the list of alternatives, the items against which each of the criteria will be applied. In this strategic risk assessment, the alternatives are a risk register, a list of the high-level risks that the organization needs to prioritize. Here you see a list of 18 high-level risks. These are adverse events such as legal compliance exposure, process inefficiency, and inadequate safety. The risks range across different categories and types, as represented in the categories on the right-hand side. The final building blocks for this model are the rating scales, the measure of high to low score against each of the criteria that we've mentioned. Since the purpose of the model is to ensure that the highest risks rise to the top, the rating scales represent factors contributing to high overall risk as the high score. Take the example of customer service. This criterion relates to the impact that each of the 18 strategic risks would have to the organization's customer service. A specific rating scale is therefore developed, expanding this to show the unique definitions in this area. From severe down to insignificant, each point on the scale is defined unique to that area of impact. The same is done for each of the other impact criteria: performance, safety, compliance, and energy and environment, so that I can measure how each of the risks scores against them. For the other 3 risk factors, we build a unique rating scale for each: probability, velocity, and effectiveness of current mitigation. Once we have gathered the stakeholders' inputs in the collect step in the process, we are now armed with the data to inform the strategic risk assessment. We start this review of the risk assessment results by looking only at the fundamental components of risk as previously described: probability and impact, the standard risk assessment approach. Here you see the prioritized list, highest risks towards the top. Now, if we wanted to see how the other factors influence the overall risk score, we can include those into the criteria weighting scenario. For example, if we wanted to see how our mitigation efforts influence the levels of risk. This new list of prioritized risks now takes into account the risk mitigation measures the organization has put into place. Remember, higher score and top of the list are risks of most concern. Note that there are some changes in order indicated by the change column, showing that some risks move up as a result of less effective mitigation measures, while some risks move down due to mitigating actions that are more effective. What about the risk velocity? If we add this consideration, notice that security breaches moves up significantly when considering velocity of the risks, which makes sense. That adverse event could come at this service provider with little to no warning. These are just some basic examples, but you can quickly see the types of insights you can gain by looking at your list of risks with each of these different factors layered in. Now let's dig into this a bit more regarding the impact. We've looked at the risks thus far from the perspective of an aggregated impact score. Let's now dive into the impact criterion to see what insights we can gain from that level of detail. Remember that we scored each risk against the impact to each of the 5 strategic objectives because we knew that it would help us answer that question. Why? Why are these risks of such concern to us? Now we can isolate the impact to find some of those answers. The list is now ranked with respect to solely the impact that they have on the organization, using a set of criteria weights developed by the stakeholders. This is the process that Suzanne and Tracy described. As you can see here, impact to performance and safety have the greatest weights and therefore the greatest influence on the results. But what if we wanted to better understand the risks from the compliance perspective because we have an audit in the near future? If I drag out compliance to maximize that criteria weight, see how the list of risks has changed. You can see that it really matters that you've broken out the impact. Your risk priorities can change depending on the type of impact that you're considering. So we've just gone through a number of screen views to illustrate one way to apply risk to decision lens at the strategic level and glean a number of insights in the process. Let's take a slightly different look at the results. What if I want to look specifically at my operational risks, how they vary in impacts to the strategic objectives, and also view which of those risks could come at me with the highest velocity? Just setting up the view here. I'm now viewing the operational category of risks from this perspective, similar to a heat map where my x-axis represents the probability of the risk occurring and the y-axis represents the impact. I've also tagged this grouping of risk by risk type, as you can see in the legend. Finally, I've selected the size of the bubbles as velocity. So the bigger the bubble, the less time I have to react. Now let's shift from the aggregated impact score to look at the impact to the strategic objectives. What is the makeup of this portion of risk? So I'm changing my y-axis to reflect safety. See how the picture changes. Because the probability on the x-axis hasn't changed, the changes that I see are the different risks moving up or down on the y-axis as we change the impact perspective. I'm now viewing impact only from the lens of safety. Inadequate safety has a clear impact, as does security breaches. What if we want to make a comparison to another objective, performance? Again, we've changed the lens and can see the results adjust accordingly. I'm able to develop a number of meaningful insights as a result. I know which risks are of most concern to me and why, which ones I'm doing the best job at mitigating, and which ones are going to come at me with the least amount of warning. Let's move on to another model to look at a different approach. The purpose of this next model is to determine the risk to a portfolio of IT projects. You'll notice some differences in the criteria, alternatives, and the rating scales. This second model is intended to determine the risk of IT projects by assessing levels of risk for subcomponents in the following areas: business value, governance, enterprise architecture, information security, and lifecycle management. Each of these criteria has subcomponents because that additional insight is important to the decision and its stakeholders. They need to understand various aspects of business value risk, for example, not just business value risk in aggregate. Whereas the alternatives in the first model were actual risks, the alternatives in this model are the investments under consideration for the portfolio. We have different tools, platforms, upgrades, and systems. Each will be scored against the distinct areas of risk. Let's move on to the rating scales. In this model, the rating scales represent risk as a risk evaluation, summarized at a red, yellow, or green level. Here's what I mean by risk evaluation. It represents a distinct step in the process of risk management. You'll note as I click through these that each of these points on the rating scale has a definition which includes how effectively that risk has been addressed thus far. Once again, a distinct approach to how risk can be addressed in these models. Let's look at the prioritized list of investments based on how risky they are to pursue or implement. In this case, the high scores for these risk areas equate to higher levels of risk, so the investments that rise to the top are those of most concern. Once again, we start out with an overall assessment with all of the risk criteria factored in. The stakeholders' criteria prioritization weights business value risk and information security risk as the two most important. We can use sensitivity analysis to look more carefully at specific components, such as lifecycle management, the lowest weighted in the process, but a distinct perspective that the CIO might want to have. While the investment at the top was already ranked highest in aggregate, several investments moved up the list significantly. They were less risky in aggregate, but are at highest risk from this perspective. These are useful insights for the decision process. Let's look at one more perspective within each of the risk areas. What if the CIO asked us which of the investments represented the greatest risk with respect to change management? I've maximized that criteria weight, so we're now armed to provide the CIO with that insight. Before we move on to the next modeling approach, let's take another look at the bubble plot view. I know that business value risk, plotted on the x-axis in this case, and information security risk, plotted on the y-axis, are the most heavily weighted in the model. What about viewing a plot of just these two areas? Let's look for IT investments that have the lowest business value risk and the highest information security risk. Two of my projects are clearly broken out in that top left quadrant. I also have numerous applications that cluster in the bottom left quadrant, where we have low business value risk and low information security risk. This could be a very useful insight for a portfolio decision process. The other adjustment that we've made is that the bubble size has been associated with the cost of each investment. So the bigger the bubble, the more expensive the project. You can see that we have a relative spread of costs across these projects. You can view the ones with lowest relative risk and low cost as some of your most desirable. This gives you the ability to look at this portfolio from multiple dimensions at once again giving you multiple ways to inform your decision process. Let's move on to another model to look at a different approach. So thus far we've looked at two different approaches to risk models. In each, the building blocks of the model, alternatives, criteria, and rating scales were a bit different. We're going to take a slightly different approach with the next model to illustrate the value in risk modeling with a dimension of time added to track the progress of certain risks. This third model is an example of a decision that captures the risks associated with implementing a new software program. What is similar to the second model is that we reviewed is that the criteria relate to different areas of risk: organizational, schedule, technical, and resourcing. You'll note that these risks are associated with the planning process, each with its own subcomponents or child criteria. In this case, however, where the model differs most is that each alternative actually represents a key milestone in the project plan. Here we see a number of critical steps in the implementation process. Building these milestones in as the alternatives allows us to periodically assess the level of risk associated with meeting those key milestones. Let's take a quick look at the rating scales. In this model, each of the risk criteria includes a scale with a spectrum from unacceptable down to minimal or no impact. Similar to the second model that we reviewed, these scales refer to the necessity of implementing mitigation plan actions as a result of the existing risk. Finally, we can look at how the milestones stack up with respect to risk. As with the other models that we reviewed, this modeling approach causes the alternatives representing the highest level of risk to rise to the top. So, in this case, we see which key milestones receive the highest scores. However, since a project plan takes time to implement and the levels of risk with these milestones will likely evolve over time, it is useful to assess these risks periodically to ensure that the project team is focused on the right areas of risk at the right time in the process. I've drawn together some slides to help me illustrate this point. Let's say, for example, that at a point in time we want to focus on how the risk is shifting for milestones that are coming due in the near term. This slide represents two snapshots of assessed levels of risk for a set of 4 key milestones, all due between May and July. The set on top assessed in March and the bottom assessed in June. What happened? The first thing that we can see is that the overall level of risk for the milestone titled Final Draft of Documentation rose significantly during this period, whereas it was previously the milestone in this near-term subset with the lowest level of risk. By June, it has jumped up to a much higher risk score. The second thing that we can see is that the overall risk the implementation team kicks off milestone has shifted from the top of the group in March to the bottom of the group in June. Here's where, once again, we address that important question. Why? Because we've assessed the milestones in greater detail, we can dig a bit deeper to be sure that we understand what we should be most concerned about. To the first question of what happened with the documentation milestone, when we isolate organizational risk at the top of the slide, we can see how much that specific area of risk shifted between March and June. This is clearly the major driver of the increase in risk to this milestone. As for the decrease in relative risk for the implementation team milestone, we can see in the middle of the slide how schedule risk decreased from March to June, clearly a major factor in the shifting from a risk of higher concern to a lower level. Let's look at one more piece of this at the bottom of the slide. For both of the two milestones in question, they each had a major jump in technical risk between March and June. While we already are watching the documentation milestone much more carefully because of the elevated level of overall risk, this view has helped us realize that we still have concerns about the implementation team milestone, despite the fact that it seemed to have decreased in relative terms. We now have the insight to be more aware of the technical risk of these milestones and can take appropriate actions. We would not have had this insight had we drawn quick conclusions from the aggregated view. I'm going to wrap this up very, very briefly with one more quick summary of a modeling with risk now as an embedded criterion, and I'll just use one slide to do so. If an R&D organization is trying to prioritize products for development, they will want to consider factors related to the opportunity that the prospective products will offer, as well as certain financial metrics. They will also want to capture the risk associated with these products. This slide shows a modeling approach that is a bit different than the ones that we've reviewed. Each of those models were primarily focused on risk. This model embeds risk as one of several criteria to include in the decision process. It is considered at the same level as the other criteria, such as opportunity and quantitative financial inputs. This allows us to gain certain insights such as which products give me the right blend of risk and opportunity, how can I best balance those two factors. You can use the bubble plot feature as shown previously to capture this perspective. Because the purpose of the model is to get the best and most desirable projects to rise to the top, we need to shift the rating scales to an inverse scale. By that I mean that the lowest level of risk, labeled here as negligible, gets the highest score. This enables the product with the lowest risk associated with it to bubble up to the top of the list. This is in contrast to the models that were primarily focused on risk, the first three that we reviewed, in which the alternatives, the risks, IT investments, and planning milestones that were of most concern due to high risk bubbled up to the top. This model prioritizes products, but the same approach of embedding a risk criterion into a model among other decision criteria can be applied to a number of decision types when prioritizing investments or capital planning projects, for example. This concludes the model review. This has been a very quick review of a handful of different approaches to building risk into your processes. There are numerous other approaches we can take, each dependent on the decision objective. I hope this has been helpful. Tirsa, back to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Carson. I really appreciate you walking our attendees through very detailed specifics about how they can start to build risk into their portfolio planning. And I know there was a lot of information for all of you in the call, very valuable information. We're going to send a recording of today's webinar after this call so you have an opportunity to review it with your teams and start to actually mirror and incorporate the best practices that were most relevant to you. We're at our final bullet point of our agenda. We're going to close out on this. This is where we get a chance to really address a lot of the questions that have come in while Carson was speaking, while Suzanne and Tracy were speaking. Let's just get right into them. Somebody asked a question. I'm going to have to paraphrase a bit because there wasn't a lot of context for it, but I think we get the gist of it. ISO 31000. I guess maybe the question might be, how would this integrate? How would this complement the efforts they're making in the area?
Sure. So ISO 31000, essentially the guidelines, the established guidelines for more of an enterprise risk management approach. One of the things that we've done is do a little bit of a side-by-side comparison of a decision lens process. So the support, and it essentially found that there was really general alignment to all the steps that are included in the process, assessment up front, going through an evaluation, and then going through a mitigation process. And we found that they're actually supporting mechanisms from the decision lens perspective for each of those steps. So I'm not sure if that was the context of the question, but we have found that we can support that type of process.
Excellent, excellent. Another question that came in, one of our greatest challenges is factoring the risk of budget cuts into our funding decisions. How should we tackle this? Any recommendations?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I've actually been working with a customer that is trying to address this problem specifically. And in their case, it's a operations and maintenance funding model where they need to continue the different projects, and it's just a matter of what level of funds can be applied. And so they're really struggling with that question of sort of the resulting risk from certain budget cuts. And we've talked about an approach that essentially captures an impact of funding cuts as a criterion. Again, all of these questions, I think, come back to how you structure a model. So if there are any individuals on the call, I think it'd probably be a little bit more detailed answer, but I'm happy to follow up with people as we've built out essentially a bit of a straw man of how we might help them with that. Mm-hmm. And then really, again, it's building in a set of criteria so that they could ultimately visually see, for example, if a criterion is a 5% impact as opposed to a 15% cut, that would just be built in as a criterion into their model.
Okay, got it. And one last question that we have time for. It's actually more of a challenge. I think it's not really a question, but it's an interesting topic. We don't feel like we have the right data. There's a perception that risk is purely subjective. It's a really interesting point to make there.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't know if Tracy and Suzanne, if you want to add anything into this as you've gone through this process and you've really felt it. My brief answer would be that it is certainly, it can be very subjective, and there's certainly qualitative components of assessing risk. So it comes down to, as we say, I think with most of our processes, you bring in the right people at the right time in the process. It's about involving the right stakeholders. The only other thing I'll say, and then again, if Tracy and Suzanne have any perspectives, where possible, where you can bring in quantitative data, for example, maybe if it's a financial risk assessment, that's great. But what we found, I think, is generally these tend to be very subjective. But you're looking at your own experts, so you really have that resource within your own organization.
Excellent. All right. So we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you, Carson, for joining us today, as well as Suzanne and Tracy. We hope you found this discussion on risk valuable. We look forward to continuing to showcase our clients, especially their thought leadership on all matters of portfolio prioritization and resource planning. And this slide really shows you some of the ways that we plan to do that. The first way we want to do that is to welcome you to visit our websites, capitalassets.decisionlens.com. You'll find a lot of resources for optimal capital planning. Our innovation.decisionlens.com is our hub for R&D and manufacturing innovation portfolio leaders. We also want to invite you to join our next Innovator Spotlight, which is going to feature Seattle Public Utilities and the work they're doing. That event is scheduled for August 21st, so keep an eye out for your reminder invitation. And finally, we want to invite you to join our LinkedIn user groups. There's the Leaders in R&D Portfolio Strategy and Leaders in Capital Planning specifically, where we can continue to have those best practices conversations via that network. So thank you again, everyone, for your engagement and your participation today. We hope that you found the time valuable. Enjoy the rest of your week.